Hey, David Brewster here with a new episode of Chordplay, and this is the Chords of Lizzy Borden, and this lesson's going to kick off the month of October here on my channel, which is Metal Month, and I'm so excited and stoked, and I've been planning for this since last October, and I do have a lot of new subscribers since last October, so I did want to clear the air. The month of October is Metal Month, where I feature, various metal bands and guitarists and music, and I make connections to horror films or books or video games, wherever I can. And with Lizzy Borden, we're talking about the band, not the little girl that killed her family with an axe, but the band. Lizzy Borden definitely took their name from her with a modified spelling. And the band, Lizzy Borden, formed in LA in 1983. They've been active ever since. They've had a lot of member changes over the years. They do have a song that appeared in a late 80s horror film. I did rant about that film last year during Metal Month. And Joe Holmes famously played with this band for a while. And Joe also worked with the late great Ozzy Osbourne. So really, Lizzy Borden checks all those Metal Month boxes. Horror films, a connection to Ozzy, the dark story, Lizzy Borden, the girl and the band and the whole thing with the axe and everything. So it definitely fits the bill, even though I guess technically it's kind of theatrical glam metal, but that's still metal. So if you're a Lizzy Borden fan, buckle up and go grab an axe, because here comes Metal Month right now. So I just mentioned that Lizzy Borden's had a lot of member changes, and I counted 10 different guitarists that have worked with this band since the inception in 1983. And, I did mention Joe Holmes. There's also Ira Black. He's worked with a bunch of people, Gene Allen, and some other players. But here's an image with the 10 guitarists that have rocked out with Lizzy Borden. So one guitarist out of that group of 10 that's worked with Lizzy Borden, Joe Holmes, which I did mention him briefly during the intro, but Joe Holmes worked with Lizzy Borden, somewhere around 1987 to 1988, somewhere around there. And, Joe Holmes studied with Randy Rhoads. I looked that up. I think it was in 1979. He took lessons from Randy Rhoads, and that obviously was before he worked with Ozzy. But then eventually Joe Holmes worked with Ozzy Osbourne, and I think it was that Randy Rhoads connection that kind of helped him get that gig. And there's just something about him. It's like, man, he's worked with a bunch of different people. David Lee Roth and Ozzy, obviously, Lizzy Borden. And cool guitarist, commonly overlooked, but it's like, no, Joe Holmes is a metal guitar legend for sure. Okay, I'm wearing a Headbangers Ball shirt, so I have to share this story. I was a kid back in the day, and I know I was under 16 because my dad was still taking me to school back then. And I do remember one morning, he was getting me ready to go to school. I had like 5 minutes before we were getting ready to leave. And I did what any teenage kid would do. I turned the TV on to like frantically watch at least 5 minutes of television. It was already on MTV. And the Me Against the World music video came on. It was like right before the guitar solo, when Gene and Joe were doing like the harmony solo, and they've got the painted graphic guitars and they're rocking out. And I'd never, heard the song before. I'd never seen that video. I had just a few minutes before we had to leave to take me to school. And I just saw that moment of the video, and I was like, what is this? And it blew my mind. And of course, my dad's like, we gotta go. So I turned the TV off, and then that entire day at school, I kept thinking about that video, and they were rocking out, and I thought, what was that song? What was that video? What was that band? And then it was months after that, like probably 4 or 5 months later, I was literally watching Headbangers Ball, and that video came on. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's that video. And then I, actually realized who Lizzy Borden was, and the band was on my radar from that moment, forever after. But literally, this music video, I remember it inspired me because, they had the cool 80s guitars, long hair, rocking out, and it was just inspiring, just to watch that video and on the edge of the couch, like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. So the chord-based and rhythm guitar parts in this lesson came from 3 Lizzy Borden albums, and during the course of his career, he's released 7 studio albums, 2 EPs, 1 live album, and 2 compilations. And in my opinion, these 3 are the cream of the crop. I mean, he has some other great albums too, no offense to the other albums, but Menace to Society, Love You to Pieces, and Visual Lies, those 3 just kick ass, and that's where I pulled, chord-based and rhythm guitar parts from, right here. All right, with the opening, that's the song Visual Lies from the album by the same name, which is on the wall right there. I'm very happy to have that in my library of vinyl. And during that opening part, I was using the MXR clone looper because there's 2 guitars harmonized through that kind of arpeggiated picking pattern. And then there's an opening guitar solo, and then eventually it moves into the verse. And guitar 1 is doing this lower harmony like this. Arpeggiating through that A5 right there. Then right there, it's going to feel like an F5 over A, which it is, or you could think of that as an implied A minor flat 6 right there. And then he does, so right there, G, C to A. Then you're cruising down the middle 2 strings of A minor pentatonic, and then shift down to that F. And then hit that low E open into an E5 power chord. And then that F, to G power chord. So that's guitar 1 right there. Now guitar 2 is playing a higher harmony, like that partial A minor right there. Right there, add that F note on the B string. Once again, that's an F over A. It could also be an A minor flat 6 implied, like that. And then right here, that's the harmony part for that single note part we just looked at from guitar 1, but guitar 2 is right there. And then I was doing higher power chords to kind of harmonize with those lower ones, E5, F5 to G5 there. So you put both those guitars together, you've got this. That's really, really cool. Then a solo comes in like this. I'm pretty sure it's Joe Holmes. There's some trills, which he probably picked those up from studying with Randy Rhoads, but something like this. Something like that. Move into that A note right there and then B to C. And right there, grab that D note, bend it a whole step to E, and then back. And shift slide into this B to C right there. And then you're doing B to C trill right there. Like I said, probably picked those up from studying with Randy. And then you're moving down. Like that. Between B and C, and then A and B, G and A, and then F and G. Now last time it hit that E note right there, and then you cruise down like that. And then a bar dip right there. But what a cool, intro part. That's a cool song. That's a great album from Lizzy Borden right there. And I had to include that because that harmonized opening part is so cool. Next up's the opening to the song Ultra Violence. This is from the album Menace to Society. Once again, there's 2 guitars here, and I'm going to use the MXR clone looper once again to kind of help me out. Guitar 1 is just doing a series of power chords, so let's look at that first. Guitar 1 is doing a B5 over F sharp, stacked like that, like a stacked power chord. Let that ring. You're going to move up to a D5 over A, like another, stacked power chord right there, a D5 over A. Let that ring, F sharp power chord to a G power chord. And then a quick change like that A5, and then hit that E5, and then you start it over again. MXR clone looper. Guitar 2 is doing this kind of open string, like hammer-on pull-off thing, like this. Something like that. So it's doing this open B. So you're doing like that open B string, and then you're basically doing this kind of like pull off hammer on between that B and A note right there. And you just repeat that over and over and over. You're going to do that through that whole cycle of chords, and then when it repeats that cycle of chords, that's where it moves up. So you're doing that A and B, and then you're going to move up here to that C sharp and D and do the same thing. Do 2 sets of that, and then you're going to move up to this E and F sharp and do it again. And then you hear this really high B. And he kind of bends that up a whole step and then releases it. And with the chords, that really has an interesting sound to it. Next up's the opening to Terror on the Town. This is also from Menace to Society, like this. Something like that. So it starts with these kind of inverted chords, an implied E minor, D major, C major, B minor, like that. Think Metallica, right? And it's real heavy there in the opening, like in the intro. And then it's just power chords after that. It's like the E5, F sharp, the G5, back to that E5, and then a C5 right there, and you're moshing through it. And then, so right there, D5, and you're lifting up that A note. Then you're grabbing this B5 and lifting up that B note to the open A string, and then move back to that D. And do that first riff again. D5, and then single notes. Next up's the riff from the song Shock. This is from Visual Lies, something like this. Something like that. Pretty basic, kind of standard, 80s, hard rock and metal kind of riff. But D5 to an A over C sharp, like that. And then you're going to basically mimic the same thing, but now on the D and the G string. So now it's a G5 to that little part of a D over F sharp. And you're kind of sliding it right there. Next up's the clean part from Ursa Minor. This is also from the album Menace to Society. Something like this. Something like that. So it starts with this D minor add 9, like that. So think of like a barred, D minor shape right there. But then add that E up on top. Like that, and you're picking through it. And And then once again, we're adding, you know, like this B flat right there. So that's going to be an implied D minor flat 6/9. Like that, because that's the flat 6 of D right there. You know, that B flat. Like that. Next up's the riff from Psychopath. This is from the album Love You to Pieces. This is actually a really cool riff, like this. Something like that. And it starts with this like picked E5. And do the same thing in D5 right there. And right there just strum that D sus2, but stop on the B string. Don't include the high E right there. Like that. This cool riff, and it changes. So like the first time you're doing the same progression, but the rhythm changes. But the first time you're doing basically E5, an implied E augmented, and then an E flat 5. So we're basically raising, you know, the 5th and then lowering it too. That. And then do the same thing in D. Keep going back to that D sus2 right there. So there it is in E5 and D5. And right there in D5. And then the rhythm changes. Now it's... And then do that again. That E to D back and forth, and that C, and then end up on that D sus2 again. And then, so like you do that E to D again, then that C to D, and then B to D, and you loop that riff. But that's an interesting song, and I love those twisted chords. You're kind of playing with that stuff. That's cool. That's really cool. Okay, last but not least is Me Against the World from Visual Eyes. We've actually looked at the bridge of this song, I think it was a couple of years ago during Metal Month. And then last year I actually ranted about Black Roses, and this song appears in that film. And I wanted to include this clip again because it's hilarious. But here's Vincent Pastore, also known as Big Pussy from The Sopranos. And this clip, like his son just left to go see Black Roses in concert, and the turntable in the house starts playing by itself. And of course, Vincent goes over to see what's going on. Like, why is it going, you know, on its own? And this is basically what happens if you don't take care of your vinyl records. So pay attention. So like I said, we already looked at the bridge from this song a couple years ago. That's a really cool like bridge interlude in the song. Now we're going to look at this little chord hit that happens during the verses. So when Me Against the World starts, it's kind of clean and quiet. Right? Like that. Just, you know, E and D to E, and then that D to C. And then you do that again, that E to D to E, and then D to A, like that. Do it again. And it starts getting louder. And you do the exact same riff with more volume, more distortion. that's literally what I wanted to show right there. Like this little pivot kind of thing. And, you know, at the end of that riff, he's basically using like the open A, and it's like a partial like G over B, and then that C5. So he's kind of like moving up, and then moving back down again. And then that's going to move you into the verse. So just hit that low E, and then that D5 to E5, hit the low E, D5 to E5, and then do that little chord pivot thing. Like that. Then the second time, everything's the same, but instead of going down, he goes up to that higher E5. And then he does the pivot thing, but then he goes up to D instead of back down. Like that. So I just think that's cool, that little chord pivot. You know, the first time it goes down, it's kind of moving you lower. And then the second time you hear it, it goes up. It's kind of like moving like the song along. It's kind of pushing things forward, or it's kind of taking things somewhere. That's really cool. All right, that's going to wrap this episode of Chordplay with this look at the Chords of Lizzy Borden. Definitely a band I've been aware of ever since I was a little kid, like the story I told earlier. You know, I had to start with this because it took me back, and it's like, man, I'm thinking about Headbangers Ball and that horrible film and the cool music video for Me Against the World with the rock out, like harmony guitar, you know, section in the middle. And like I mentioned earlier, that blew my mind when I was a kid because I'd never really seen a video like that where it was just high energy. You know, Gene was playing that like painted Jackson and stuff. I think Joe was playing like a Charvel with the Lizzy Borden, you know, logo on it. And they're just rocking out back to back and side by side and trading licks and solos and harmonizing and stuff. It just blew my mind. Of course, I was like 14 or 15 years old, but still, I remember that left an impression on me. And putting this episode together, it took me back where it was like, man, I totally remember seeing that video, and I was just like, what is this? Because I was so blown away. And all these years later, I remember that, where it's like, yeah, man, Headbangers Ball, Lizzy Borden, you know, Halloween and scary movies and eating candy and listening to metal music. I mean, that's really what Metal Month's all about, and I'm so excited to finally get this started this year. This is technically the 6th year, so it's the 6th, you know, anniversary of Metal Month. I've got tons of great stuff in store and some surprises, so stay tuned. Anyway, in the meantime, please leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Nail Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content and material. Thank you.